I've been involved in climate change for more than 10 years. And it's really odd to say that my high point in making some progress lies with dealing with Sarah Palin. Believe it or not, you know, before she became a national politician, she did believe in climate change. So we'll get in on that. But what does that say about Alaska in terms of the challenges that someone like myself has to face up there? And if Sarah Palin was my high point, and I've been really pushing hard ever since then, I could get really discouraged. But I'm not, and I'm hopeful, and you're going to find out some reasons why I'm still hopeful. But first, I'd like to share with you a little bit of context about Alaska that people don't usually hear about in terms of our resource politics, because it's very unusual and different. First off, you know, we are the state of the largest and biggest everything. You know, we have the largest temperate rainforest in the world, the tallest mountains, the most national parks. We have over 34,000 miles of coastline. Yet, 2.5 years ago, we repealed ourselves from the Alaska Coastal Management Program. So we're the only coastal state in the nation that isn't part of coastal management. Oil and gas dominates our politics. 80 to 90% of state government is funded on oil revenues, depending upon the price of oil. But yet, even though oil funds our state, it's founded on fish. It is the salmon industry that pushed for statehood and even got sustainability in our Constitution. So we're the only state that has that concept in their Constitution. And this point I bring up a lot. We are the poster state for impacts because Alaska's been heating up at twice the rate as anywhere else. And our images of Alaska are all over the place. President Obama came and did his presentation on climate change right before going to Paris. But we're also the poster state for inaction. We still don't have a state governor involved in this issue. I'm still working on that. Had a conversation yesterday with the governor. But the third point here, it's also one of the most amazing states to experience the wildness and the wilderness and that closest to nature. You know, so in terms of being connected to the environment, probably no better state in the country. But it's also one of the most difficult states to work on behalf of the environment. So it's a state of contradictions. And since I've been involved in resource politics for over 22 years, I've kind of come up with a few strategies on how to work your way into the politics as an underdog politician. And I'm going to go briefly through these, so I'll be happy to come back and talk more about these little 8 strategies. Parts of it are in the book. They are all in the book, actually. So one of the things I make a point of is if I'm going to meet with a legislator or a politician about any resource issue, I have to make a personal connection first before I do an ask. What did I talk to Sarah Palin about when I first met her? Basketball. She's a point guard. I was a point guard. We connected. And then I made my ask, and she came through. It's always important when you're doing conservation politics in a deep red state is to go where the decision makers go. You sign up for the Rotary, you go to the chamber meetings, you go to the ball games. You see yourself, you present yourself as an everyday person that cares. And I start off on friendly territory. When I did finally have a full-fledged meeting with half-term Governor Palin and her commissioners, I came armed with a petition signed by 11 evangelical ministers to get involved in climate change. You know, I use conservative messengers wherever I can. And if I have a different hat other than a green hat, because I do have a fish hat, I was the executive director of United Fishermen of Alaska, so I wear my fish hat more before I would wear my green hat. Those are techniques that you have to use in dealing with red states. This one, play big when given the chance. When I was the director of the Alaska Conservation Voters, there was a real pushback against Governor pushing the natural gas pipeline, wanting the state to fully fund it. The unions got involved because it was going to divert money away from capital projects. I said, let's get involved because we have the grassroots connections. So in other words, if there's a weak budgetary or whatever the conservation connection can be, if you have a chance to play on a big issue with other big players in that state, do it. Avoid hot button topics or hot button words or terminology. I don't mention Al Gore anywhere when I'm in Alaska. And I would say climate change instead of global warming a lot more often. And then lastly, I give credit when, even though it's something minor, but I give a lot of credit so that I can ask for more later. An example would be Sarah Palin. I got her to establish the goal of setting ourselves to be 50% renewable energy by 2025. The first governor to make that statement. Did she put any policy emphasis behind it? No, not one. But she was out there. I gave her all kinds of credit. I then could go to the legislature and say, let's put something substantive behind that goal, which we did do. And this is an important one, always address the economic considerations. I coined a term early on, and I called it economics. I found that when I would be going to testify, there are people looking to peg you in one corner or the other. Are you going to be here for industry or are you here for the environment? Boom, boom. And if I said the word economics, they had to stop and listen to what I had to say before they figured out how to peg me. And then I would always address the environmental connections up front. Those are things that I have worked on in the past. Now I kind of want to emphasize to you that I'm informed a lot by science and I'm informed a lot by policy, but I'm also very much informed by nature and my environment. And this is my backyard. This is the Mendenhall Glacier, where I have been recreating for over 20 years. And as you can see by the diagram here, it's been in fast retreat. And just to give you a little flavor of from how I kind of mix up my policy stuff with my nature writing, I just want to read a little bit here from the book. I've been visiting the Mendenhall Glacier regularly for the last quarter century. Through those years, I've come to think of it as part of my everyday life, a friend of sorts. Like any friend who one visits repeatedly over the years, the Mendenhall Glacier marks my family memories. 2 decades ago, I played on the sandy moraine with my school-age children. Then the face of the glacier stood near the waterfall. Now it's about a mile away, and my children are grown. Not only have I played here, I've prayed here as well. I affectionately call the Mendenhall the Church of the Latter-day Glacier. Listening to a deep blue spear of ice groaning to fall free from the glacier's hold, I prayed for loved ones to be released from terminal illness here. Here I can understand the transformation from ice to water, from river to ocean, from life to death, and life again. The glacier, in its largest meaning, comforts me. But in its near meaning, it also disturbs me greatly because I see it as my bold, barren barometer of climate change. I've been watching this retreat for over a quarter of a century. All right, so this is, I'm going to lead into my 10 points of hope, okay? So, that gives you context of how I have to face the reality of climate change constantly. And I can get discouraged, so I did plant hope spots in my book, but I always feel it's important before I talk about the hope spots that I kind of ground everybody in the reality. And I came up with this little catchy way of kind of getting your situational awareness at all times, right? So let's just count it out here, right? We have one Earth. There we are, one Earth. 2 degrees Celsius. Everybody knows what that means, right? In terms of that's the marker for the Paris Climate Agreement that we want to avoid. 3, we have 3 times more fossil fuels than we could ever possibly burn and stay below 2 degrees Celsius. 4, if we keep business as usual, by 2040, we're going to consume our total carbon budget. And right now, we're at 400 parts per million. So 5, this is when I turn to people and I say, if we don't do anything on climate change and it runs unabated, Name me 5 consequences. Water rising. 1. More intense hurricanes. 2. Come on. What? Death from intense heat. 3. 4. Yes, species mass extinctions. 5. Exactly, exactly. In any region you go to, people can name those 5, at least 5. Some you can go on and on, but just to kind of do that. So this is my situational awareness. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I keep always in my mind. And then we always have barriers to progress. Many of these barriers are what we have to face on a national level. We have a dysfunctional Congress. We have a disproportionate influence of big money through Citizens United and looking at corporations as persons. We've had a sustained climate denial campaign being run. And if we have 3 times more fossil fuels than we could possibly burn, that means big corporations need to strand assets. And that is very undesirable and a difficult hurdle to overcome. And number 5, I once said number 5 was that climate change was a long-term issue, but now after these hurricanes, the awareness of people is that it's here now. So, but it's still a big and complex issue to a lot of people. And people like to avoid evidence, anything that makes them feel insecure and I can't do anything about it. So those are always barriers out there that we have to deal with. Can't quite see this as well because of the sun, but anyway, one of the things I like to do is mix in stories when I talk. So about 10 years ago, my husband, who's sitting in the back there, we went, it was New Year's Day, and we went for a walk out to Boy Scout Beach, one of our favorite places, and it was partly cloudy, and the sun was breaking through, and there was the godlight imagery and everything, and it was gorgeous, and, you know, I can wax poetical, and I was saying to Bill, you know, maybe this is a sign that things are going to change, that the political pendulum's going to swing back, because at that time, we had the Iraq War, the healthcare crisis, Bush's attack on environmental regulation. It was really bad news, and I'm trying to be optimistic. So Bill, ever practical, is giving me all the reasons. Yeah, but, you know, with all the harm that Bush has done on regulations, no time soon are we ever going to make any difference on the environment. And I'm like, come on, go with me here. I'm just looking for anything, for a sign. So what happens? All of a sudden, I look up, and 2 whales are breaching, you know, on New Year's Day. This is a really rare sight to see, let alone, you know, 1 whale, but 2 whales in the middle of winter. It was like, it was awesome. And so I like, okay, I'm going to go with this here. And I started telling people about this, and we went to a bonfire, and we all decided to make this the year of 2 whales breaching. Much like in the native lore, they'll notice, oh, this is the year of 3 bears swimming, or, you know, that type of thing. So we called it the year of two whales breaching. And I thought this was an appropriate image for my point of hope, because when I started on the book, my first chapter is Whales, Waves, and Wonder. And I had just finished the chapter when this photo appeared on Facebook. This is not my photo. A friend of mine took this photo and posted it on Facebook. I took that as another sign. Okay, I'm going to work on this book. Because he said, yes, you can certainly use this photo in your book. And the beach that we were at is right. That's my segue into my points of hope. And one of the first things that I think is really hopeful for me is there's more and more awareness that a sound economy and a sound environment are one and the same. That this dichotomy that they are opposed to each other is being pushed back. More and more people get that connection. And particularly in a red state, that's really an important development there. And just to show you that this is indeed happening, This is a report that EPA just came out with, and this is under the Trump administration, okay? Obviously, he didn't know this was being said by his own administration, that shows economic growth and environmental rules can coexist. And more importantly, on a global level, we've had 2 years straight now where we have global emissions have declined, and at the same time, the growth rate globally has increased by 3%. So we see this decoupling of emissions and economic growth. And it's very, very positive. And when all we have to do is talk about solar power. Right now, the rate of growth for solar in this country is 17%. It's higher than any other sector anywhere. So greater awareness that synergy rules is my one point of hope. Number 2, the millennial generation. It's you guys right here, you know. Because I don't know if you've read the book or looked at the book, Millennial Momentum, where it talks about how once every 8 decades, a generation comes along at a momentous point in our history, whether it's the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and they become the new great civic generation. And the millennial generation, meaning those born after 1982, is being identified as that next civic generation. So these are people that study sociological demographic trends that proclaim this. So, and in regards to how these trends play out for saving the planet, essentially they identify that the millennials' enthusiasm for taking individual action to fulfill collective responsibilities in the marketplace, as well as the voting booth, will tip the scales in favor of pro-green policies at both the national and international level. The millennial generation first showed up in force for Obama in 2008. He did not show up in the equal force this last election, but I still have faith. Number 3. Point of hope is the rise of women in work and business is significant. It's contributing. In 2010, women for the first time became the majority of the American workforce, and over 40% of managers are now women. And you might ask, well, why is this important? And if you do any research, you'll see from polls that women tend to vote for more pro-green policies than men on average, a little bit more, about 10% more. Women have a deeper sense of community and inclusiveness. When they are engaged in corporations and businesses, you see it's women that tend to push for corporate social responsibility. It doesn't mean that men aren't doing this as well. They are. But the fact that the more women integrate, the more these community-based values are coming into play. And so that enhances sustainability overall. So I see this as an encouraging sign that the bottom line is that the contribution of educated women is on the rise, and this is really good for sustainability. And there's a picture from my book. Here's the Strong Women in Sustainability, and yes, the water is very cold. I like to add stories and points of relief here. Number 4, what I oftentimes have to come back at when my state isn't doing much, and the U.S., we haven't really adopted the policy changes that we need to do, is I look at what the rest of the world is doing, and they get it. And they are making incredible progress, and we have so many shining examples. And part of the reason why the rest of the world is making progress is they don't have the same barriers we do. They don't have a dysfunctional Congress and as much influence of big corporations. You've got countries like Denmark, which is on track to be fossil fuel free by 2050. And they have an extensive district heating program, and they have a huge push for electrification for their vehicles. So they actually are well positioned to achieve that goal. It's not a lofty goal, it's a really achievable one for them. Germany has been a leader on the environment as well as the economy. France is now positioning itself to become the first country to ban all exploration permits for fossil fuels. as well as banning the conversion of exploration permits into production permits. Throughout Latin America, for example, they are booming with solar production. We have 40 countries right now that have a price for carbon in the world. We don't, but we have 40 countries in the world that are doing that and showing that it works. And also, I think that's really encouraging here is the pushback that President Trump just got by when he decided not to sign on to the Paris Climate Agreement, is the pushback by cities and states around saying we are still in. And we all know that the individual actions, community actions, actions at the local and regional level are really what's going to make a difference in the end, not just big national policy. And so the fact that, you know, we've got 12 states that have officially signed on and say we're still committing to the Paris Climate Agreement. We have hundreds of cities. You now even have cities like Pittsburgh and Atlanta committing to be 100% renewable. And I think if they can do it, many other cities can do it as well. So it's encouraging to get these kinds of headlines, and this is just a recent headline. So we are still storming ahead. Let me go back one here. The next one I want to talk about is love of place. And this notion of how powerful love of place is really very well articulated in Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything. I don't know how many people here have seen it or are aware of it. But she talks about the power of love of place and how it is the one thing that she believes will save the planet. And I'll get into a little bit more on that. Her book is This Changes Everything. And it's extremely well documented. So what she did is she went around the country and she looked at places, you know, not only the indigenous people blocking the Dakota pipeline, but you also have ranchers in Texas that are standing up to fracking and saying no more fracking. You know, and I think that this is a very important quote here. It's not the hatred of the coal and oil companies or anger, but love that will save the place. When what is being fought is an identity, a culture, a beloved place that people are determined to pass on to their grandchildren, there is nothing companies offer as a bargaining chip. Yeah. And this is my love of place right here. This is a picture outside from our living room window, downtown Juneau. You can't help but love that place. And this is my summertime, my love of place. The Mendenhall Glacier in the background. My daughter and my husband. Because in Alaska, oftentimes what love of place means is love of salmon. So sometimes it is so true. So sometimes it's whatever there's, you know, culture identifies with. Whether it's, you know, out in Wyoming in the west, it's going to be, you know, love of the wild open ranches. So I put a lot of stock in this, and we see in Alaska that it's that love of salmon that is pushing back on places like the Pebble Mine in the Bristol Bay watershed. So it is indeed a powerful force if you can tap into it. Number 6 on my list, alternative consumerism is rising. I once worked for the Marine Stewardship Council, setting up an international eco-label program, and I was able to see firsthand on how effective the marketplace can be to promote sustainable changes. And right now we have over 458 eco-labels in 195 countries. That's a lot. And recently the researchers from Yale and George Mason and the University of Texas found that the consumption of green products is growing rapidly in the U.S. because communication that creates concern about global warming and enhances beliefs about the power on consumer action is likely to stimulate green consumerism. So as the awareness about climate change rises, people are more interested in looking at eco-labels. So there's a nice synergy going on here. And by this, it's organic, it's the local board movement, buy local. So I've often been a believer in the power of the marketplace. And if we can tap that, we need to. Number 7 on my points of hope is the grid parity of renewable energy to electricity. And let me explain to you first what grid parity means. And the reason I pair this hope point along with these bubble feeding whales is because both are transformative. And I'll explain this in a second here. So what does grid parity mean? It means that for many utilities now, they can source their energy at a competitive price from wind and solar at the same price as coal and natural gas. First, it was displacing coal. Now, wind and solar in many parts of the country is displacing natural gas for utilities. I mean, in terms of price point, and that's so important to have. And as I like to, these are actually quotes from Al Gore, and I could say his name here, right? And somebody who has extreme knowledge about the whole climate change situation. Let me hold on a second. I'm going to drink the water. But he's also a major investor in the global markets. And so if he recognizes that the difference between ice and water is the same difference between markets that are frozen up and liquid flows of capital into new opportunities for investments, that's the significance of grid parity. It's the same difference between ice and water. I just think that's a very powerful analogy. And then he reminds us, now that we have that solar has grid parity with fossil fuels, that there's enough raw energy reaching the Earth from the sun in 1 hour to equal all the energy used by the entire world. And that's where we need it a lot. So this is extremely hopeful. And why I say it's transformative and put this picture on here is because when I first moved to Juneau, I moved to Juneau in 1992. I lived in Alaska a lot earlier, 1920. I'm not that old yet. Oh, oops, I did that. It was very rare to see bubble feeding whales. And now we see a lot more of it. So what happens when, what used to be the case is whales would feed one at a time. And then a couple of whales got really smart about using their vocalizations to call and signal everybody. So what bubble feeding is when there will be a series of whales that surround a ball of herring, and as they go down, they release bubbles that act as a net. And the herring are too spooked to swim through the net. So basically, they are netting the herring. And then the lead whale, which is the whale right now, open up his mouth and gape, will give a piercing sound. That'll be the signal. They will all then turn and rise up, mouths agape, and feed cooperatively. And there is no place, so this is the only place in the world where this level of highly organized cooperative feeding has ever been observed. And now we see it in Prince William Sound, 450 miles away, and elsewhere. So, yeah, and so the reason I like to pair this with grid parity is because it is transformative, and these whales are, just showing that level of the power of cooperation and the spread of knowledge, and that's what we're doing on solar energy. And this is a chart that shows that when we first started to address climate change, people made projections, and they figured that we would have 1 gigawatt of solar power being added every year. And when 2010 came around, we bested that mark by 17 by a factor of 17. And now in 2017, we are beating that mark by 58 times. So in other words, we are exceeding our best projections that we made back then. And that, in my mind, is transformative. The other major point of, another major point of hope is the disinvestment campaign. And this is trying to go right after the need to keep 3 times the fossil fuels in the ground. And it has been a big success. Started in the campuses around 2010, and has really caught on. Let's see, right now, by December 2016 of this last year, we now had a total of 688 institutions and over 58,000 individuals, representing $5.5 trillion in assets divesting from fossil fuels. And according to Naomi Klein, no tactic in the climate wars has resonated more powerfully. So this is going right after the power of corporations and that need to keep fossil fuels in the ground, and it's working. And it's catching on faster than any other disinvestment campaign that has ever happened anywhere else in the world. Number 9, world religions. All major faiths now have issued declarations of the need to address climate change. And this is a quote from Pope Francis, who has written an encyclical, Laudato Si, about the need to care for our common home. This is unprecedented to have all these world's faiths address the need of climate change. And in my mind, that's an underlying current that is equally transformative. And number 10 is one of the most important changes, and it gets to the title of my book, and I'm running a little bit out of time, so I'm not going to read from the book, but I'm going to give you a short little version of this story here. I got a chance to go on a 27-day raft trip down the Grand Canyon in November. And it was the trip of a lifetime. I had 2 weeks to try and to prepare for it. That was all the notice I had to say yes, and I took it. And when you are in the Grand Canyon like this, there's no place on earth that lays out time better than the Grand Canyon, because all of these layers represent thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of years. And I realized I was feeling, after floating on the river for like 2 weeks, not seeing any other sign, it becomes a little overpowering to see these layers of time before you, and you begin to feel really insignificant. And I was learning a lot about the geology. And there was one point in time where there was this place down deep in the very bottom of the Grand Canyon where you come across this geological point of interest called the Great Unconformity. And what that is you have the Tapeat sandstone, which is a 500 million year layer of rock sitting on top of the Vishnu schist, which is 1.6 billion years. So these layers are right on top of each other. So there's a point in the Grand Canyon where you can put your hands on each side of that gap, and therefore hold a billion years between your hands. You know, I just thought, wow, this is amazing. You know, so I no longer felt insignificant, because I realized it was my awareness, my sense of time and place, that really puts meaning and power on all of this. And that it's that great awareness of mankind and our consciousness that can also be transformative. And so, and I am going to read briefly one small portion here, because it really ties into what my 10th point. So let's see. At the top of these walls lies a thin layer of loose rock that represents the Anthropocene era. The Anthropocene era is the term that geologists use to represent the imprint of man, all 250,000 years of our collective existence since Homo sapiens evolved on planet Earth. When we ponder the imprint of modern mankind as represented by 7.3 billion people, all seeking a middle-class lifestyle, the disruption of habitat, the extinction rate of 200 species a year, the ability to pollute to a level capable of altering weather patterns and acidifying the world's ocean, we see clearly that mankind is an evolutionary force. Instead of being a species forever evolving through the forces of nature, we are now the sole species forcing nature to evolve on our terms. This is the other great unconformity. It too is missing from these walls, not because the river has eroded it away, but because its time span is too short to be noted in these layers. It is my hope, my belief, that the great awareness unconformity of mankind, the one that can hold 1 billion years between their hands, the one that is part of the global mind, wins out in the end over the great disruptive unconformity. Let the soul of the world redefine the Anthropocene era in this way. This is my canyon dream. So what I mean by the great awareness unconformity is also a recognition that mankind is an evolutionary force, but creativity is also an evolutionary force. Physicist and author Bill Russell points out in his book that we see more innovation and more change in 1 year than the pharaohs did in 100 years. And that this level of creativity breeds creativity. And these are just a couple of examples of things that I read every day about what we are doing. I mean, the whole idea of us being able to capture solar power and mimic leaves and photosynthesis, we're on the edge of that. We have the ability to now store some of the solar energy. We now have the whole island of Kauai, which is being relied on solar energy through day and night. You can now, Tesla is now looking to put solar panels on top of electric cars. You know, so, and because of the internet, these things are happening at an incredible pace. So I believe in the end, I'm hopeful in the end that creativity is going to be the real edge for us in this race of time that we have against climate change. And I don't know if anybody is aware of this book, Drawdown by Paul Hawkins, where he actually, and this is a tribute. 70 researchers together looked at, okay, not only how do we stop climate change, but how do we actually reduce emissions, take that, you know, draw down the amounts of carbon that we're putting in the air. You know, and they came up with 100 solutions. And they range from simple things like educating girls. Educating girls is number 6 in the book because they find that educated girls will have 4 to 5 children less in the world. Number 1 in the book, to me, I had no clue about until I read this book. Management of our refrigeration units, that air conditioner in the back. How do we dispose of it? Because the hydrofluorocarbons in that air conditioner is far more potent than CO2. So this is an amazing outcome of creativity. And it's so, for me, I found it really hopeful, the notion of smart highways and everything. So this is the best documentation that there is that creativity is an evolutionary force. And with that, I will say thank you for coming and ask you for questions.
One second, please. I need to give you the microphone.
One of my pictures.
Yeah. You had that half Earth from the moon,
And then
the other side was through Saturn's rings.
yeah, that
Okay,
was
that a
Cassini.
view of Earth?
That was, yeah.
That tiny little pinpoint of light?
Let's go back to that. It's pretty amazing because that was from the Cassini satellite that just crashed into Saturn.
There. One more. Yeah.
Right there. This is Earth.
Yeah. Okay.
That is Earth.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
wanted to make sure it wasn't the sun.
Yeah, that's from Saturn. I mean, so I put this in because this was an iconic picture that really launched the environmental movement in so many ways, you know. And if that motivated a lot of change in the world, this picture should do the same and even more so. It just shows you, Yeah.
It was, the one on the left, widely used on the back of various issues of whole earth catalog.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it really is credited a lot with being a change agent in the environmental movement.
A fun fact and a question. The fun fact is that Tesla was at one time a researcher here at Tufts. There's a street named after him just on the other side of the hill. And the question is, in your slide on parity between renewable resources and carbon-based resources, where does hydroelectric fit into that picture? I mean, I know it's not on the carbon side, but you know, where do you see the future of hydroelectric power?
That's a good question. In regions like where I live right now, hydroelectricity is already far cheaper than fossil fuels. And that is because we don't use big dams. We do what's called lake tap. So nowadays, I mean, hydropower used to be thought of as hugely expensive because you would have to build massive dams to capture that force. And now we have in-river turbines, and we have the ability to tap lakes and tunnels. So we can cap hydro without the high cost. So in areas of the Pacific Northwest, it already has grid parity. But it's not going to be readily available as much as wind and solar is throughout the rest of the country.
You talked about eco-labels as being a point of hope for you.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see them more as an indicator of general interest in, like, sustainability in that broad term, or is actually a force for change when people buy those products? I see it as...
It's both. It is both. My experience directly with the Marine Stewardship Council was that I saw a lot of fisheries actually having to deploy changes in their management to maintain that label. So the market impact wasn't so great initially, but now what a lot of eco-labels will do is they don't automatically translate into more money for whoever does that practice initially, but it opens up new markets and niche markets. And then that helps bring either the farmer or the fisherman or the rancher into the program. And then once they see a little bit of adjustment, all these eco-labels have stipulations. If you want to maintain that label and renew that label, then you have to meet certain requirements. And that's where you actually will see the on-the-ground activities for improving the sustainability. So it's both an awareness on the consumer level and at the individual level. I find that the eco-labels are most effective in the renewal process.
I wanted to thank you for a really stimulating presentation. I really liked the way you opened it, but I'm curious about your 10th one, where you said creativity is an evolution. I think it was evolutionary force, and I'm wondering why you. I think I understand that you had made the point that human activities are affecting the evolution of Earth, of organisms on Earth right now, but I'm kind of curious as to why you didn't use the word ecology or something that's more sort of immediate as opposed to evolution for your 10th one. And I was wondering if you could sort of talk a little bit about how you picked the words for number 10.
Oh, that's a good question. I think primarily because I think ecology and awareness of what we can do on the ground is extremely important, but it's not going to be enough. We have to make changes, you know, from the technological standpoint, from the society standpoint of how we, you know, build our communities, from our land use standpoint. So creativity was just more encompassing.
No, I'm sorry. The creativity is perfect.
Okay, as an evolutionary force?
As evolutionary as opposed to ecological force. I think you're using the evolution in a way that maybe is not genetic changes in populations. You might be using it in a different context. And so I wanted to sort of hear you sort of expand on the word evolution in that last one.
Okay, well, because we have 7.3 billion people on this earth, and yes, so we are an evolutionary force in terms of our disruption, and I just like the parallel, okay, of being able to flip that around and be hopeful that we can be, that creativity is also an evolutionary force. And it wasn't me who first came up with it. It was this theoretical physicist who has studied the pattern of changes as well, looking back. And Peter Russell is his name. And he came up with that concept. And I just thought it really fit. So that, and because I want us to think of creativity as an equal counterpart to our disruption. You know, to me, it was more hopeful to put it that way, I guess.
I like it. I just wanted to explore it a little bit more.
Colin, your problem is just that you think the biologists own evolution. They don't own evolution anymore, not since we recognize cultural evolution, and the meme is changing faster than the gene.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed your interspersion of narrative. And one of the narratives that you interspersed was the story of your career journey. But in case students are wondering, how can they learn to be such effective masters of narrative? Can you tell us a little more directly about your career journey and what students, if students look at you and say, oh, this is a role model, how might they follow in your footsteps?
My career journey. My first job in Alaska was driving taxi. No, but my first professional job was working in coastal management and for a small community in the city of Haines. And it's one of my better stories in the book, in that I came from Yale. I had my master's degree. I was ready to learn from the mistakes of the lower 48. We're going to do things different up here. And this was my first assignment, and I'm meeting with the city council, and I'm just supposed to go over the planning process. And lo and behold, the whole town has turned out, because what's brewing in this town is the issue about setting aside a preserve to protect the eagles, because they have the largest concentration of bald eagles anywhere in the world, versus the timber, right? And I was like, well, we'll get into that in the planning process, you know, kind of thing. And there is this logger that, you know, interrupted the whole meeting and said, hey, I've got one question for you. What good is an eagle if you can't eat it? And I'm like, what? You know, I was just stunned. That was not a question that my Yale degree had prepared me to answer. You know, but I realized how I answered that question was really going to be very important. And so I talked about how they want to diversify their economy. Tourism is part of it. And I was able to go through and talk. You can mimic. If you have a glacier, you can compete with Juneau for the glacier. You have natives. You can compete with Ketchikan for the native thing. But the thing that they had and nobody else had was the eagles. So I talked about how, indeed, you can build a whole tourism thing around this, and the eagles will put food on your plate. You know. So, in other words, I recognize the importance of synergy, of seeing how to think, not as a trade-off, but how can you promote both? And that was how I answered that question. And it became a real key foundation for me, that awareness. So then I did coastal management work for a while. And we moved to Ketchikan, and I worked there for the city in coastal management. Then I had babies, and then I wanted to get back into work. And the best job I found was working for the Southeast Alaska Seiners, for the fishermen. And because fisheries is so tied to conservation in Alaska, it was a real natural fit for me. At that point in time, we were discussing how to reform the timber management in the Tongass National Forest. I was allowed to go represent United Fishermen of Alaska before the U.S. Senate, and really made a big difference in establishing the fact that we now have 100-foot buffer strips on all salmon streams. You know, so you get, in other words, I got a really big win under my belt, and got recognition. So that was really great, and went on to become the executive director for United Fishing of Alaska. And then I did fisheries work for the state of Alaska. I needed to get my state benefits and all of that. And that's what got me into marketing. So, which was interesting because it was wild salmon versus farm salmon at that point in time. So really got into how to use the marketplace to promote wild salmon. Tried to get salmon into the organic label program. I got denied that. They don't consider wild salmon organic. That's a whole other story. Yeah, then, from there, I've also ran for a local office and got elected in Ketchikan and also in Juneau. Then I wanted to expand my horizons, and when the Marine Stewardship Council was first starting up, I helped them get their first test fishery established, and then they offered that job, and that was pretty exciting. I was a regional manager for their North America office, and so that meant all of North and South America was my region. I traveled a lot. And then after that, I really wanted to try and do conservation straight up and wearing a green hat. I was doing a lot of conservation work, but wearing a fish hat or wearing a local politician hat or a mom hat, And so that was a really unique experience, and that's when, Sarah Palin came along at the same time, when I was the head of the Alaska Conservation Alliance and Alaska Conservation Voters. And then since then, I ran for office again, got elected, and then I decided to do writing. So the book, and then I've been writing screenplays. I have 2 screenplays that have things to do with climate change and ocean acidification.
All right, so almost all the discussion on climate change has been about emissions reduction. Drawdown and the technical text geotherapy have begun the discussion of removing carbon from the atmosphere. I see the need for 3 ideas. Emissions reduction, extending into a zero emissions regime where 0 is an approachable goal, as in total quality management, and advanced carbon drawdown using geotherapy rather than geoengineering. Have you seen evidence of others beginning to think this way?
Just from what I've read, yes, I've seen that evidence. One of the key technologies here is, carbon capture from the atmosphere, creating places, silvicultural practices in the forests to try and capture more carbon, and that's a much better direction to go in than geoengineering.
Yeah, so thanks for the talk. One thing that I've been particularly interested in is how you wear so many different hats, and it seems like all those different hats are essential to getting your message across and communicating with the diversity of people. If you only wear one hat, or if you only have one hat to wear, what is your chance, or where should you focus your efforts if you're interested in kind of spreading this? Are there any techniques you should say, like, if you only wear one hat, or you wear different hats? I'm just curious to explore the idea of hats and
yeah, the idea of hats. I think it's going to vary depending upon where you live. And for me, because salmon and fish is so integral to Alaska and how we think of ourselves, that was indeed the best hat I could wear, and I loved wearing it. And in the Midwest, it might be more of an agricultural ranchers associated with that. If you're an organic farmer, being a farmer. Many times, if you're concerned about environmental health and you volunteer at a hospital, then wear a nurse hat or wear an environmental health hat. So I think it depends upon the community and the state and the region that you live in.
Is it wear what you know, or wear what you think people want, like who you're trying to connect with?
It's both of those things. It's both of those things. So when I'm dealing, like, you know, with a lot of the legislative type people. And a lot of them are consumed with energy issues. So I was on the board of the Renewable Energy Alaska project, so I would wear that renewable energy hat. I would wear an energy hat when I was trying to talk about what are we going to do vis-a-vis having a statewide energy policy and trying to reduce emissions. You know, when we established the renewable energy grant in the state legislature, the word climate change was not mentioned once, not once. All we did was we talked about the impact of the price of diesel out in rural Alaska and how they got to get into an alternative and when was their cheapest alternative. So I just kind of got to read the territory, I guess is what I'm trying to get at, and where you want to be and what emphasis you really want to strive on. But yes, it's been helpful having diverse hats. Yeah.
Thank you for these inspiring and hopeful talks. And before we finish, do you have any words of advice for all of us? What is the most powerful action we could do as individuals to make a difference?
For you individually and at a community level, be the future of your planet. Keep that in mind. Be the future of your planet.
Thank you.